So Bellows is kind of doubling down on this painting being about hard work, the products of labor. My name is Oliver O'Donnell, and I'm an art historian. We're looking at a representation of a group of men who are about to unload a steamship on the New York waterfront. We know that we are in Brooklyn looking across the East River because some of the buildings on the New York skyline in the distance are identifiable. What dominates the painting in the center is a large steamship, which creates a very strong orthogonal line that projects into the distance. And it's really this juxtaposition between the foreground scene of the men at work on the docks and the background scene of the skyscrapers of Manhattan that's connected by the steamship. Bellows was also very attentive to color contrasts and color harmonies, and you can see that in the painting as well. There's these kind of subtle oranges and reds, especially along the steamship's hull. And then there are these recurring kind of notes of blue, both in the funnel of the steamship, the clothing of the men on the docks in the foreground, and then, of course, also in the water that separates Brooklyn from Lower Manhattan. The painting was made in February of 1912, and we know the really pretty precise date it was made, at least the month that it was made, because Bellows kept very detailed records of the work that he produced. And each page of the notebook is dedicated to one of his paintings. He kept records of where they were exhibited, how much they sold for, and even did little sketches of each of his paintings in the notebook to note the color harmonies in the painting and to remind him of what the painting looked like. Bellows was from Ohio. His father was a Methodist minister, and he came to New York and he fell in with a group of friends who subsequently become known as the Ashcan painters, or the Ashcan School of painting. Bellows and the other Ashcaners typically focus on working class labor and very often examine that labor through this kind of slightly gestural brushwork. This is one of my favorite paintings from the Ashcan School in particular. I think it's an especially important painting in Bellows' oeuvre in particular, as well as in the Ashcan group in general. It really exists in this kind of key moment when the Ashcaners are in New York. They're depicting the labor of the city. This canvas is part of a series of canvases that Bellows makes of these interstitial zones between land and sea all around New York. He really goes to the different geographic corners of the city and makes canvases capturing both the kind of more rural sections of New York as well as the more urban and gritty sections of New York. In the painting, we see a kind of heroization of labor, and that's especially notable because there's this sunlit group of men standing in the foreground who are kind of mulling around, presumably about to unload the steamship. On the left side of the painting, in the shadow of a warehouse, we see a man who's isolated. And it's very tempting to try to read in a story to this social dynamic that we see in the foreground. The looks, the glances, the exchanges of eye signals are very kind of tantalizing when we look at the painting in detail. But we don't, of course, really know what the story is. But it creates a certain tension and a certain drama, and that's part of what draws us in to that foreground scene. There are some peculiar details in the painting. If we zoom in and we look at some detail with the central man, we can see that he is depicted with just one eye. His face is in a slightly kind of three-quarter view. And that's the same type of view that Bellows shows us of the horses. The man also has an elongated face, much like the horse's face is elongated. Between the men and the horses to their right, there is a rather ambiguous or amorphous black shape that can be read as a shadow, can be read potentially as a figure that isn't quite recognizable, but it can also be read as a kind of connecting thread between the group of men and the horses beside them. It kind of exists in this negative space between them, and that's another reason why it seems like Bellows is making an analogy between the men and the horses. We also know from Bellows' work that he very often represented horses and tugboats. These are both icons of toil, of labor. So Bellows is kind of doubling down on this painting being about hard work, the products of labor. The city of New York that's in the background of the painting is also, to a certain extent, a product of that hard work, of that effort. Monumentality is also, I think, an important concept or theme within the painting. We see that the men are kind of heroized and made larger than life by way of their affinity with the horses beside them. We see the steamship itself, which is extremely long, and its length and its size is very much dramatized by the way it's positioned in the painting. And then, of course, we also see the massive skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan in the distance. So in all three sections of the painting, we see kind of representations of scale, of monumentality. In the background of the painting, there's an especially interesting detail surrounding the Brooklyn Bridge's pier. You would never be able to see a pier of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Singer Tower from one specific spot on the Brooklyn waterfront. They're just too geographically distant. So it seems as though Bellows has added the Brooklyn Bridge Pier to make the scene more identifiable as New York. This potentially also has to do with Bellows courting his patrons and trying to make a canvas that would be saleable and kind of interesting to potentially to an industrialist or another art collector in New York. He actually misrepresents the pier of the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge famously has pointed arches. We see that he's rounded those arches. This suggests that he's actually painted the pier from memory rather than from life. The politics of the painting are rather ambiguous. The scholarship on the Ashcan School in general, as well as on Bellows in particular, has the tendency to read these paintings as kind of celebrations of labor, but it's also possible to read the painting in relation to the politics of the industrialists who were collecting this painting and that also were arguably exploiting the labor of the men on the docks who are represented in the painting. And since Bellows' clients were really these upper-level industrialists, to what extent he's sympathizing with his patrons or with his subject matter is, I think, especially difficult to determine. It also is just a kind of masterful example, mesmerizing example, really, of Bellows' facility with oil paint. That contrast between the depth of the paint in certain parts of the canvas and the thinness of the paint in other parts, especially in the background where he's representing the buildings. These contrasts really just show the kind of technical ability of Bellows as a painter. The Ashcan School was initially a criticism or an intended criticism of these artists. The idea was originally that they just merely painted ash cans. This is an American colloquialism for a trash can. And how could you create art out of a mere painting of a trash can, right? It seems to be a kind of contradiction in terms. But as is often the case also with many names for schools of art, the name somehow stuck, and it has been perpetuated ever since. The very idea that one would depict a working class subject and ennoble that subject by turning a representation of them into a work of high art, this is somehow an uncouth decision, right? That it somehow goes against the norms of what art should be at the time, that is trying to kind of level the playing field, or to say that works of art somehow belong to everyone, or that everyone can be the subject of a work of art. It's really an amazing and very welcome addition to the National Gallery's collection that this is an American painting. Ashcan paintings are really not that well known outside of the United States. The Ashcaners themselves disperse after the First World War, so they're really only in New York painting scenes like this for a rather short period of time. And so it's really great that a very prominent one now exists within such a great collection as the National Gallery in London and can be positioned within this broader tradition of European painting that the National Gallery has undertaken.